A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to our event on the EU and human rights with Michael O'Flaherty and Eamon Gilmore in conversation. Today is Human Rights Day to mark 70 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly in Paris in 1948. And as important a day as it was back then, I would argue that the occasion is even more important today because we're facing tendencies across the globe where human rights are being pushed back and framed as a disadvantage or an advantage only for the others, for minority groups that don't include me. And I think in these times, it is so important to stress the benefit and the value of human rights for everyone. And it is with particular delight that on behalf of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights, I welcome Michael O'Flaherty and Eamon Gilmore, the Director of the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency and the EU Special Representative of Human Rights here tonight, because arguably, and Mr. Gilmore and I argued about this earlier, we have the two most important human rights actors that the European Union has on offer here tonight, and that's something to be proud of. I would now like to, without further ado, welcome two people to the stage who helped make tonight's event possible. It's Mr. Gerhard Dujak from the Austrian Federal Ministry of, sorry, it's a bit difficult to get the English title together. Let's call it the Foreign Ministry. And Mr. Tomas Weber from the European Parliament, our host in this beautiful building here tonight, to the stage. Please, would you join me, gentlemen? I would like to ask the two of you for your motivation in helping us host this event tonight, because it was all very short notice, and that's also another reason to thank you all for being here. We had less than 2 weeks to organize it, and we were delighted to do so. And I would like to ask, why are you supporting us tonight?
Thank you, Patricia, but let me first start by joining you in welcoming our guests here today. Thank you very much for coming all tonight at very short notice. I think it's a good occasion. For me, it's a particular pleasure also to welcome Mr. Gilmore and Mr. O'Flaherty. For me, it's the two faces, as we say, for the European for Human Rights. For me, I think it's the first time that we have that I see you two together. I see, in fact, the special representative and the representative of the Fundamental Rights Agency, the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency, together in the same event. For me, it's a big occasion, and thank you very much for joining us here tonight and giving us the occasion to listen to you. You asked us, what was the motivation. I think that well, today is the Human Rights Day, and I think this is not only the situation where we commend the work of the two leading persons of the European Union. I think we are particularly proud in Austria to have the Fundamental Rights Agency here in Vienna. We are hosting this important organization here, and I think I would like to take this opportunity also to thank and to the contribution of its dedicated staff to this work here, to the city. They are contributing to the discussion and to the orientation of the discourse here in the public life, and I think this is very important. Thanks to Michael O'Flaherty, it's a voice, but it's also a lot of work, and you see a lot of brain which goes into the work, and thank you, through you, to your staff. I would also like to use the opportunity to thank you, Patricia, and the European Union, not only Fundamental Rights Agency, but also the House, the European Union, for hosting us here tonight. And maybe there is another element which I think is particularly important. When we are speaking today of human rights, it is, in my opinion, particularly relevant that we must live up to the values of the European Union, and to promote and to live with the promotion. And this may be even more crucial in a situation where European values and freedoms are becoming under threat, and as we witness increasing reprisal against human rights defenders. And I think the discussion today will help us to give maybe some answers to to the challenges we're going to face. And I think we have a lot of seen about activities. Now we are hopefully discussing a new EU action plan on human rights and democracy coming up from the Commission and from the EES. The European Union will have to live up to its commitment, and maybe we can help through this discussion today to see a bit further what will be the challenge over the next 4 or 5 years. Thank you very much, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Gerhard. I would also like to welcome a welcome statement from Tomas Weber on behalf of the European Parliament and the European Commission tonight, I believe.
Thank you very much. I would like to join you in thanking everybody who came here, who participated, and in having this event on Human Rights Day for us. Why do we support this event? It's our job and our duty as the House of the European Union. And indeed, I have the honor to speak even on behalf of the European Commission. I believe we have a record number of institutions hosting this event now, including the Council. And yeah, so our job and our duty is to communicate the European Union, to tell people what the European Union does, and on Human Rights Day in particular, to show people how the European Union is committed to human rights and the defense and promotion of human rights. You see on the walls, for example, the Ilham Tohti, who will be awarded the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought next week. Ilham Tohti is an Uyghur, an economics professor, jailed in China for supporting the rights of the Uyghurs, even if he tried to promote communication and understanding between the Chinese, Han Chinese, and the Uyghurs. And so that's what the European Parliament will do next week in relation to human rights. And all we do and communicate about the European Union, it is important to underline that human rights depend a lot also on the EU's activities in supporting them. Now you ended by giving a view in the next few years. Now what will happen in the next few years is, for example, the multi-annual financial framework in terms of communication. You all know that there is, for example, a financial instrument for the promotion of democracy and human rights. And there's a human rights aspect in many things the European Union does. In much of the legislation, data protection and whatnot, there are human rights aspects, and for us it's important to show and support the activities that communicate about the European Union defending human rights.
Thank you so very much. Again, thanks also very much for your support in making tonight possible to both your institutions. I would now like to hand the floor over to our distinguished panelists and our chairwoman tonight for your discussion, Ms. Johanna Bostock. Please come and join me on the stage, and thank you very much for being our chair tonight. Johanna Bostock will be familiar to many of you by her voice. She has been with the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation for 20 years. She has been the head of FM4's current affairs program Reality Check since 2011. She frequently features human rights on the show, and I think I'll leave you in very good hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And I think the next step is for me to invite our two distinguished guests onto the stage. And when we're seated, I'll... I'd rather be on the end, because then I can see both of you. Right. Now that we're sitting comfortably, thank you everybody for coming this evening. And first of all, I'll introduce Michael OFlaherty, who is the director of the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, which, as was mentioned before, is based here in Vienna, and Eamon Gilmore, the European Union's Special Representative for Human Rights. I'm going to quote a little bit of EU text before I start asking some questions. The plan is for me to start the conversation by posing some questions to both of you, and then we'll open up the discussion to questions from the audience. So the little bit of EU text I'm quoting here is that there are two main streams of human rights policy and action within the European Union. One is to protect the fundamental human rights for EU citizens. This is where you, Michael, come in. And the other stream is to promote human rights worldwide, which is what you, Eamon, focus on. So I'm going to start with Michael here in Vienna. When we talk about fundamental rights, we're talking about the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. What added value does the Charter provide when we already have, for starters, the Declaration of Human Rights, as well as a number of human rights treaties?
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to start, though, by saying that a charter, a treaty, an instrument is only that. It isn't going to transform our societies. It's not going to change a life. It has to be used. It has to be applied. And if you use the Charter of Fundamental Rights in a smart way, it can make a really serious difference within the EU context. It guarantees rights that you won't find in the European Convention on Human Rights. For example, a right to a safe environment. It extends rights that you find in the European Convention, like the right to justice and a fair trial. It has new rights you won't find anywhere else, like the right to found a business. And this is very important. It is binding national law in EU member states when they're acting on a piece of EU business. And that you don't find with the other treaties. And that really matters when you look at the extent to which the Charter contains rights that you will not find in national constitutions. So it is, when used cleverly, it's a pretty impressive tool to make a difference, but we're not using it enough. This is the 10th anniversary year, and we see that we're neglecting it, particularly at the level of member states. And but we could do a better job, and that would ultimately help people in respect for their rights.
And what does the work of the Fundamental Rights Agency entail on a day-to-day basis?
That's a big question. We're there, firstly, we're not an executive. We don't make decisions, we don't make policy, we don't adopt laws. We're advisory. And we're only as good as the quality of our advice. We advise the EU institutions and the member states so that they can be fundamental rights compliant. We do that, for example, by gathering data on the experience of rights holders. What's it like to be a Jew in Europe today from a human rights point of view? We know because they told us through one of our surveys. What's it like to be gay in Europe? The same thing. And then we feed all of that data back to the policymakers. We often put things on an agenda that wouldn't otherwise be discussed. We're only talking about Afrophobia in Europe today because of something we produced last year. But we also do other kinds of work. We're on the ground, in the field. We're in the reception points in Greece, helping people be more respectful of human rights, of the children and of everybody else. And we do a lot of capacity building and awareness raising and supporting the national structures so that they're better equipped to do their job.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now turn to Eamon. As the EU's Special Representative for Human Rights, your task is, and again I'm quoting an EU text, to enhance the effectiveness and visibility of EU human rights policy. How do you go about doing that?
Well, my office, my role was created in 2012. The European Union is already doing a lot to promote and defend human rights right around the world. And I suppose these days we're probably expected to do more because some of our former allies in this area have pulled back somewhat, and there's a very, very big agenda. The idea of the Special Representative was to bring some added value, to do some things that the institutions weren't already doing. So I suppose the kind of thing that I do is at a couple of levels. First of all, we have human rights dialogues with third countries. We've over 40 of them. I don't do them all. I do some of the bigger ones and some of probably the more sensitive ones. So I've done China, Colombia, African Union. We had, for example, yesterday, not quite a human rights dialogue, but we had what we called consultations with the United States. First time since 2015 that the United States, that we've had these formal consultations between the European Union and the United States on a human rights agenda, full day, full agenda of issues. The second thing that I do is I go to countries where there are difficulties. So for example, I was in Myanmar in June for obvious reasons, but also because we have trade preferences with Myanmar, and that's under examination at the moment, and I went there to have meetings at high level. A lot of the meetings that I have are generally at government level, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Justice Minister level, and very often on a specific agenda on the human rights space. So I do those countries. I did Bangladesh at the same time. In the new year, I'm hoping to go to Egypt. I'm hoping to go to Russia. So we have a list of countries that we go to. And then the third thing that I do is I talk very closely with the other multilateral organizations, particularly the UN. I work closely with High Commissioner Bachelet and with her people, with the UN rapporteurs. I've met 3 different rapporteurs in the course of the last 3 days. And then I suppose fourthly, and very importantly, is with civil society. civil society, the organizations who work on human rights, who are based here in Brussels, but also in each of the countries that I go to. Part and parcel of what I do is to meet with civil society, and then try also to meet with real civil society, because in some cases, you know, in some countries where there are difficult human rights issues, what are presented as civil society, you know, are essentially government-sponsored bodies. So it's to try and get under that and to meet, and then to try and also bring a bit more coherence, perhaps, into what we're doing on human rights, because in the external area, it's mostly under the External Action Service, but we're also doing it through the development work, through the humanitarian work, through the trade policies, and part of my role and part of my objective is to get a greater degree of coherence and a greater degree of punch into what we're doing collectively.
You mentioned Myanmar. One of the big headlines today is the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Myanmar, is at the International Court of Justice, defending her country against accusations of genocide. This is a woman who was long seen as an icon of human rights. What's your response to today's developments?
Well, I think it's a good development. First of all, that she's there, because many countries that have cases against them don't turn up. So I think I would credit her, first of all, give her credit for turning up and responding. Secondly, because there are serious questions that Myanmar has to answer about its treatment of the Rohingya over the past number of years. And I'd met with, when I was there in June, I met with, was in Cox's Bazar, met with the Rohingya. And thirdly, because I think that we have to, I think we have to strengthen the international justice system, the ICJ, the ICC, the various institutions in The Hague, which have been coming under a lot of pressure. So it's a welcome development. I don't want to comment on the case itself, but I think it is a welcome development for a number of reasons that she's there.
You talked about human rights dialogues, yes, with different countries. How effective is that? It sounds nice, but what does it actually achieve?
Well, some of it is very formulaic, and I sometimes come out of some of these meetings saying, well, you know, what have we achieved today? I think the important thing is that they take place, because it is a set-piece event, usually every year, where there is a discussion with a country on a human rights agenda. Better to have it than not to have it. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that I found, and my experience of them has varied. I mean, some of them have been surprisingly good. Brazil, for example. Now, we've had a long relationship with Brazil on human rights issues, but because of the change of administration, we wondered, you know, how that was going to go. And in fact, we actually ended up having quite a good dialogue with Brazil and set down a number of areas where we will make progress into the future. The African Union, the last African Union dialogue, there were high hopes for follow-up from it, which didn't happen. So in this one, we concentrated on areas where there could be some practical follow-up on, for example, issues like transitional justice, on business and human rights. And interestingly, we also had very recently a dialogue with South Africa, and the importance of that, obviously in terms of the human rights issues in South Africa itself, but I think the importance of it was that South Africa will be taking over the presidency of the African Union in the new year, and therefore will be in a position to give a new leadership to the African Union, hopefully on the human rights agenda.
Bringing the issue back to inside the European Union, one of the questions you said, Michael, as an example for the research you do, is that what is it like to be gay in countries in the European Union? And sort of a current example is Poland, where we have a number of towns who've declared themselves LGBT-free zones. What can the European Union do to address these things?
Yeah, I think the biggest more, what can we all do to address them? The EU, within its own competency, working with everybody else. The first thing is to push back against nonsense. That's nonsense. There is no LGBTI-free zone. That's based on some weird understanding of how our societies are in reality. So push back with the hard evidence. Let the voices of gay people in those towns be heard. Give them voice. Remind everybody of what the law says. It's very clear. You cannot just arbitrarily discriminate against a group of people in that manner. And across the diversity of the different tools in the toolbox, the EU, the Council of Europe, the United Nations, engage the system and reject the unacceptable.
You're talking about the toolbox, and you described your work as being evidence-based and doing research and so on. Can you describe an example where an issue that you've taken up in the research at the Fundamental Rights Agency has led to a positive outcome, a constructive approach?
Yeah, I could give many examples, but so that people don't get the impression we're some kind of a research institute. Let me answer you with a different type of example. When I first went to Lesvos, to the Moria reception facility in Greece back in 2016, children were running wild all over the place. There was no basically there was next to no child protection in place, and the handful of children that were getting special protection were in a cage, worse frankly than a cage in a zoo. Now, we engaged on that, and we worked with people on the ground. We didn't come up against resistance on this, by the way, but there was a serious lack of skill and experience, and we worked with those people over time, so that there are still serious problems in these facilities, but the extremes we saw then, at least until recently, disappeared, and at least a significant proportion of the children weren't in cages, but were in homes, in some form of guardianship arrangement. That's one example, but given the nature of our work in the EU context and the reality of lives which happen locally, we have to rely on a chain to see the change. And we're satisfied if we contribute meaningfully to the pathway that eventually leads to the change. It's rare that the Fundamental Rights Agency would or even should say that happened because of us. That would kind of undermine the investment in national capacity, national human rights commissions, national equality bodies, national civil society, the governments themselves.
Can I go back to Eamon? Do you ever find, is there an inherent tension between trying to communicate the human rights message and the importance of human rights, and at the same time not offending other governments and maintaining good relationships for the sake of trade deals, for example, which are then important for citizens within the European Union who are dependent on those deals to a certain extent for their livelihoods?
I think they go hand in hand. I mean, clearly the pursuit of interest, the pursuit of trade agreements obviously is very important for European Union and member states. I suppose the valuable element is that all of the trade agreements that are made by the European Union have human rights clauses and labour rights clauses and environment clauses within them. So part of what we are doing in pursuing the human rights agenda is also pursuing the implementation of those clauses. Human rights is part of the DNA of the European Union. It's part of what we are. It's in our treaties. It's what caused the European Union to be established. So in all of our relationships with third countries, people know that human rights is part of the package. When a country meets the European Union at whatever level, summit meeting, not just meeting with the representative on human rights, but in meetings generally, human rights issues are going to be on the agenda. So we have a record of consistency in pursuing the human rights agenda. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes countries are not at all happy, but we do it, and part of my job is to do that specifically. I know that when there are high-level meetings between European Union and countries, summit meetings and so on, part of the ask sometime may be for a visit from the Special Representative on human rights to have a specific discussion on a list of human rights issues. So it comes with the package. European Union includes an engagement on human rights. And I think there's been an increasing effort also over time to weave that thread through all of our engagements with third countries. Now, does it always work perfectly? Is it always done all of the time by every member state, it varies, but that's the objective, is to do it. And to bring consistency to that, we also have this action plan on human rights, which is the kind of the roadmap. And then we have these guiding principles, guidelines, EU guidelines of 13 or 14 different areas which bring a consistency to that. And then we have what are called country strategies. In 125 different countries, there is a strategy on human rights and democracy strategy, which is drafted by the European Union delegation in the country concerned, and then obviously approved through the Brussels machinery. So there is a consistency in what we're doing.
Are you ever confronted with the criticism that maybe the European Union shouldn't be preaching to other countries if it doesn't have a 100% clean record at home?
Yes, and frankly, in the engagements that we have with third countries, and quite rightly, raise with us issues about rule of law, in particular European Union states, the kind of question that that Michael addressed about LGBT rights in some countries, issues relating to migration, issues relating to Roma. That there are issues that are raised with us. And actually, that's one of the reasons that I'm here in Vienna these 2 days, because Michael and I are going to sit down tomorrow with his people to look at the human rights performance within the European Union, so that me and my office can be better equipped to address these issues when they are raised with us.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. It's just the way you put your question, that some countries would accuse us of having no business talking about human rights until we're 100% ourselves. Nobody will ever be 100%. Europe will struggle into the future. Other countries will struggle into the future. We have to acknowledge that the human rights project is never complete. New challenges will constantly introduce themselves, but that's no reason not to engage on human rights. And while Eamon can speak about what Europe says to the rest, I could maybe also say about the extent to which we need the rest of the world to help us get our record right. We're Europe in the world, as Kate Gilmore, the UN Deputy High Commissioner, memorably put it at an event here a couple of years ago. And for instance, in the context of delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals, we will do that much better within Europe if we learn from the Global South that has decades of experience of development programming, how to do this. For Europe, very novel thing.
Yeah, I just want to follow Michael on that, because I think this is an important point, because sometimes there is the perception, and I hear it a lot, that Europe is coming with a preachy agenda on human rights, that somehow human rights is a kind of a European luxury of the developed world, and that countries in challenging economic circumstances aren't ready for it yet, and that social and economic rights come first, and so on. And I think it's important that, and certainly in the approach that I have to doing the work that I have to do, we have to approach it, I think, from that we're not preaching, that we're that this is not. I think it's the humility that we have to show. First of all, if we talked earlier about the Declaration of Human Rights, we have to think about the environment and the circumstances in Europe which gave rise to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have to think of the human rights violations in Europe in even more recent times, which gave rise, for example, to the creation of the ICC and the Rome Statute, and the whole issue of war crimes. And I think we have to speak with it. And I think we have to acknowledge, as Michael says, that no country has the perfect record, that we have to learn from each other, and that we do this in partnership with countries, and also that we recognise that the indivisibility of human rights, and that economic and social rights are just as important as civil and political rights, because there is the perception, certainly in the Global South and in some of our discussions, that Europe is just interested in the civil and political issues and doesn't have the same interest in the economic, and we have got to make sure that the two go hand in hand.
I have lots of questions, and I'm sure people in the audience have some questions. I'd like to ask one more before we invite questions from the audience. A slightly different thing, because you mentioned new challenges. Protection of personal data is a fundamental right under EU law. Amnesty International recently published a report on the way Facebook and Google work, describing the business model as a threat to human rights. I just wonder if I could ask you both for a response to that, given that it encompasses everybody, people in the European Union and everywhere.
Sure. May I go first?
Yeah.
I just want to add something, though, nothing to do with your question, to what Eamon has just said. I just want to take the opportunity to say that we have to be very careful about this term European values. It's not working externally. It sounds like a hierarchy, that our values are better than your values because they're European. We are increasingly speaking of those universal values which Europe holds dear. It takes longer to say, it's a bit wordier, but it's much more appropriate in a context of the instrumentalization of language and categories. So, but now, yeah, look, the more broadly, the digitalization of our lives, social media, but well beyond, embracing all the dimensions of artificial intelligence, is transforming our societies literally as we speak. It's not going to go away, and human rights has to engage with it at every dimension. Sure, it's about privacy. But at least some bits of privacy we've got sort of not under control, but we're addressing through the GDPR. There's more than GDPR needed, but that's the global lead intervention to protect privacy, including in the online space.
Could I just add that Amnesty says that this business model is inherently incompatible with the right to privacy and poses a systemic threat to a range of other rights, including freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of thought, and the right to equality and non-discrimination. So it's...
Yeah. No, look, the risks go way beyond privacy. That's what I was about to say. You've mentioned a number of other rights. I'd mentioned the socioeconomic rights. It's not about Facebook and Twitter, but if AI gets discriminatory in terms of social welfare provision, that then becomes a violation of socioeconomic rights. So the entire range of human rights is challenged by the digitalization of our lives and the force of social media. The regulation has started. More regulation is needed. We don't know yet what kind of regulation we need, for example, in AI. It's probably going to be sectoral. It isn't going to be a global one-size-fits-all approach. But the idea that voluntary codes will fix it are redundant. The effort now has to be in figuring out what the regulation should look like that would deliver the social good, but in respect for human rights, not overly restraining expression, not being excessive, being proportionate in the restraints, things of that nature. We're at the beginning of a very long journey, and the Fundamental Rights Agency is heavily invested in this journey. We published a report a few days ago on human rights and facial recognition technology. We did one earlier on how algorithms can discriminate. We're gearing up towards a major research result next year on all of the interfaces of artificial intelligence and human rights. That mapping has never been done. We talk about it as if we've already sorted out where all the problems are, but we haven't. We know a bit of them here, a bit of them there, and this global mapping is needed so that the law and policymakers can jump in. So yes, intervention, regulation is absolutely needed, but the digitalized world is not going to go away.
And Eamon, this has an international element to it. It's not simply European Union.
No, and we're seeing, we're talking about the risks to privacy, but I think there's also the agenda of surveillance, the way in which new technologies are used, the way in which new technologies are beginning to be used by states and by regimes for control of their own populations. So that is part of the agenda as well. I think that we have to look, one of the difficulties I think we have in this space is that the pace of technological change and the pace of digitalization has been much faster than I think our capacity as people to respond to it. And to some extent,
to governments?
Sorry?
And the capacity of governments?
And the capacity of governments, yes. And I think that what is happening is that to some extent I think we're playing catch up now on the human rights agenda. And what we have to do is we have to try and get ahead. And I think that the new Commission and President von der Leyen, when she set out as one of the priorities for this Commission, is the issue of digitalization. And that includes the human rights dimension of the digital agenda. I think that is something that we have to do, and we have to do it also. I mean, we look up, I think quite rightly, at the risks and the threats to human rights of new technologies and AI and all that is changing. But I think we also have to look at the opportunities that it is giving, the potential there is for enhancing and improving freedom of expression, freedom of organisation, freedom of assembly, and we're seeing some of that already. We're seeing, for example, some of the mobilization of peoples. We saw it first at the time of the Arab Spring. We're seeing it more recently, the protest movement in South America, that people are finding their expression using new tools. So I think we also have to look at its potential, its liberating potential, as well as the risks.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we sort of barely scratched the surface of the topics that one could ask questions on, and so I'd like to ask if there are any questions from the audience. Okay, I think young lady in the middle, second back row, I think you had your hand up. Yes?
Can I take it?
Oh. Sorry.
Thank you very much. My name is Magda Bierta. It's actually very nice having both the internal and external perspective here, and I also think it's important that we reflect on the discrepancy between EU holding very high standards externally while we are facing persistent human rights challenges internally. And on that note, I just wanted to reflect on the EU funding. The EU is also the biggest international development donor, and there is ample evidence of EU funds being misused, both internally and also externally. Just one concrete example, for example, building institutional care that further segregates persons with disabilities or children instead of investing in solutions that are in line with human rights. So I just wanted to ask your opinion, or how optimistic you are in the midst of the negotiations of the next EU multi-annual financial framework. Do you see any guarantees built in the new framework that would guarantee better standards in terms of human rights protection when it comes to spending EU money internally and externally? Thank you.
I'll let you two decide who wants to go first.
Look, you're quite right. There is an inconsistency in terms of what we say externally and what the realities are inside, but we've already conceded that. There's very major problems within the European Union. It's not quite your question, but let's put a few of them out here on Human Rights Day. The levels of poverty in the European Union are unacceptable. 25% of our children live in poor households. That shoots up to 48% if those children are Roma. We have the very worrying levels of hatred, systemic, almost organised hatred that we're seeing across societies, and the migration situation, and I could go on. So we have very serious problems. We have exactly the kinds of abuses that you describe, of a persistent institutionalization of people who should be cared for and respected in the community. But I am optimistic. There are budget negotiations on right now for fundamental rights conditionality of the disbursement of European funds, not just what they call the ex ante examination, but an ongoing review of the disbursement of those funds with the possibility of the funds being held back. That, if it happens, and it's still in negotiation, I give you that, will be a game changer. It'll be enormously significant. I also look with I find very encouraging the extent to which negotiators are referring to bodies such as national human rights commissions as possibly being the entities best placed to do this monitoring at the national level. Now, they'll have to be resourced for it if they're going to be given that role, but that would be indeed almost a game changer for them as well in terms of their status and the role they play in the society. And just one last thing I'd say is that there is incremental strengthening of the internal machinery to protect fundamental rights in the European Union. Now, it's far away from your question, and maybe our moderator will bring us back to it later, but I would mention the area of rule of law, where I do see a capacity of the institution to engage. It's taking its time, but it is going in the right direction.
Next, sorry,
yeah.
Pardon.
You're right that the European Union and the member states is by far the biggest financial contributor to the promotion and defence of human rights right around the world, including the financial support that is provided to the UN system. Let me express just one word of caution when we're discussing this topic. There are people who don't want that to be the case. There are people who, and I say this from experience, I was in the chair of the General Affairs Council in 2013 when we negotiated the last MFF. And I remember very distinctly the pressure that there was to reduce funding for development, reduce funding on human rights. Why are we spending European taxpayers' money on all of these things? So let's be cautious, first of all. And the weak point that people who promote that argument will always seize upon are those cases where there are difficulties about what is being spent and where it's being spent, and sometimes issues of accountability. So I think we need to bear that in mind, that there's a bigger agenda sometimes going on, particularly around the time when MFFs are being negotiated. That said, where there are questions about projects that we are funding, I think we have to address them and address them rapidly and effectively. And I think one of the best ways of doing that is by using, to a better extent, our people on the ground, our own delegations. We have human rights points persons now in most of our delegations around the world. I met with them. We had a conference here of them, or in Brussels, not in Vienna, in Brussels not so long ago, but using their knowledge and their on-the-ground experience. And I also, frankly, I see it as part of my role also, when I'm doing my country visits, is to be sensitive. And sometimes I do pick this up, particularly from civil society organizations, where they tell me that, something is not quite. Now, again, I have to look at that. We have to look at that sometimes a little bit carefully, because sometimes you can meet a disappointed bidder for a particular project, somebody who wants to be a partner, and they have a complaint about who won it and so on. But it is something that we have to address. I agree with that, and I also think getting more coherence between the different arms of the EU that deal with human rights, between the EEAS, the development, all of the different arms. I think it's also important, and that's obviously very much a work in progress as well.
Thank you very much. Another question is the young lady with the scarf.
Thank you for your speech. I have a question regarding Iran, and I want to know what is your exact policy regarding Iran. In the last 3 weeks, we had a mass arrest, and many people, over 400 persons, they killed, and the government parliamentarian, they said around 7,000 persons, they were arrested because of the attending in a democratic and a peaceful demonstration. And now we are facing every year the situation is getting worse and worse, and I want to know what is the position of the human rights bodies and human rights organization of the European Union within all of these nuclear deals and nuclear issues. Where is the position of human rights, and how do you negotiate with Iran in that sense? As you said, you have a specific policy for each country. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, in relation to the demonstrations and what has happened in Iran over the last number of weeks, which we've been very concerned about, we issued a very strong statement in relation to that just a few days ago. So there's been a strong, formal EU statement on the situation on Iran and on the protests and the numbers of people that have been killed. Human rights is very much a part of the EU's engagement with Iran. That engagement, as you know, is around the whole issue of the nuclear agreement and the architecture that was established for discussions and engagement with Iran. I'm hoping as part of that, there are high-level political discussions that take place with Iran. There's a round of that discussion that is due to take place. We don't have a date for it yet, and human rights will be part of that engagement, and I expect to participate in those discussions and to pursue with the Iranian authorities the human rights situation in Iran. As I said, we don't have firm dates for those discussions yet, but I'm hopeful that they will take place in the not too distant future.
Could I jump in with a quick extra question? Because I'm curious, are there negotiations that are more than on a sort of bilateral level or talks? Because, for example, what the United States does with regards to Iran has an effect on Iranian people. So do negotiations, dialogues encompass more than the European Union and one country? Is there a sort of a wider approach in talks about how what different countries do affect each other's situations?
Well, I think it's very regrettable that the United States withdrew from the Iran deal. That leaves the European Union and the member states of the European Union that are party to the Iran agreement very much, if you like, holding the can for engagement with Iran. And I think that engagement is very important. I think the approach that has been taken by the United States, frankly, is not helpful, and would hope that might change. As I said, we had consultations with the United States yesterday, and this was one of the issues that we talked about.
Thank you very much. Further questions?
Sorry, I have this other question too, I forgot to ask you. For example, in this period, they cut internet for all 80 million people for 5 days or around 1 week. No one can contact, they could monitor all of this demonstration, and also for media and all of the suppression, so the things is not getting out to the Western states and the media for foreign countries. And unfortunately, we didn't see the good enough coverage of the media in European Union. I don't know for which reason. I tried to contact lots of media, but they hadn't enough interest to cover that, and they wanted more proof. And in those kind of cases, because France, for example, or some other countries, they said, we will support Iranian people. But for example, in these kind of cases, is it exist some tools or some mechanism to provide internet to people in another way? Because now government, they want to make internal national internet system, which would be under control of the state in all over the country, and then it would be worse situation. So is it any other policy which it might be offered by the European Union? Thank you.
Well, on the closing down of the internet, I mean, that was one of the issues that was addressed in the statement that I referred to earlier, was criticised very strongly in the statement. I don't know the answer to the question as to whether or not there's, efforts being made to find some alternative ways for information or some alternative internet provision to be arranged, but it's something that I can certainly inquire into. Get back to you.
Other questions, comments? Gentlemen?
Thanks very much. Kevin Dowling, the Irish ambassador to the OSCE, and indeed, Eamon, you chaired the OSCE yourself in 2012, and so you'll be familiar with a number of its facets. I suppose I have an external and an internal question, if that helps. On the external side, I wonder, do you see even greater scope for collaboration with such organisations as the OSCE? It's a very disparate membership. Of course, the European Union is a big influence there, but there are many other states that wouldn't share exactly the same number of concepts that would be evident in the Union. And I wonder if you would see, for example, with ODIHR, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, scope there, or representative on freedom of the media. Just your thoughts would be interesting on what scope there might be for that. For Michael, it's often said that the European Union has either a nuclear weapon for member states that may be falling short in the area of rule of law, or has instruments that are not yet sufficient, so to speak. I think you have referred to some of this, but I wonder if you could expand on some thinking on whether there is scope for finding a middle ground in that area. Thanks.
Yes, Michael. the issue of the OSCE, I mean, we very much value our relationship, and the EU has a close relationship and support for the OSCE. On the human rights agenda, it's clearly an important partner, as are regional organisations throughout the world. I met with the Secretary General of the OSCE relatively recently. I met him at the Council of Europe Ministerial in Helsinki. And I hope, I won't be able to do it on this visit, but I do hope to have a more detailed discussion with the OSCE. Collaboration with ODIHR, for example, we do a lot of collaboration. Election monitoring is a very big part of what the European Union is doing in third countries in defending and promoting democracy, and we work closely with ODIHR and also with the OSCE, with the Parliamentary Assembly's election monitoring operation. The media freedom in the OSCE, we work also with national minorities. We have a working relationship. But I do acknowledge, and again, you refer to the time that I chaired the OSCE. I mean, even then, there was difficulty of all of the three baskets. I mean, the one that was always most difficult in getting agreement, because it had to be done by consensus at the ministerial meetings, was on the third basket, on the human rights, which is ironic, given that it was the third basket, and what happened after Helsinki, 1974, 75, that it was the third basket which drove so much change in Europe in that period. That this is now the area which is the hardest on which to get agreement.
I know it wasn't aimed at me, but I have to also say that we have fantastic collaboration with the OSCE in our particular context. They help us, we help them. In terms of how we help them, we make available to the OSCE our methodologies, for example, on surveying vulnerable groups, so that they can roll out those methodologies in OSCE participating states that are not EU member states. And this was the case most recently on violence against women. But we're looking at this type of cooperation across a number of issues. How do they help us? We work very closely together on the ground with Roma communities, sharing experience in terms of empowering Roma communities across the EU. And in fact, I was in Warsaw, I think it was just last week, with the ODIHR director to talk about strengthening our cooperation. And she and I will do field visits to Roma communities early next year as a demonstration of how we can work very well together. Haarlem Desir, for example, we work closely to the extent that we have an overlapping interest in free media, similarly with his predecessor, Dunja Mijatovic. The list could go on, but that's not the question you asked me. You asked about the rule of law. I'm both surprised and encouraged by the relative speed with which mechanisms are emerging, which none of them will ever be described as a nuclear anything, but which are, in a human rights context, not bad in terms of nudging us all into a better situation. We will have an annual rule of law report issued by the Commission. That's quite a significant innovation, and that will trigger debate and attention around this very sensitive issue in a way that hasn't previously been the case. We have we have a lot of support among states for, and an already emerging idea of a peer review procedure, if not either in or closely associated to the Council of the European Union. Across all of the developments of the Commission, of the Council, even of the Parliament, there's a recognition that the Fundamental Rights Agency will have a big role to play. It'll be the role to generate that reliable, comparable evidence base that's needed so that any new procedures for rule of law oversight are seen as fair and equally engaging the situation across all the member states, and not just perceived to be picking on this or that country. So it's encouraging, and it doesn't get enough attention. I should also add, by the way, the extent to which the European Court of Justice has been acting in infringement context infringement proceedings in relation to the rule of law. This has been very sturdy. It's shown itself to be a strong human rights court, and that's a not inconsiderable tool in that toolbox as well.
Can I just say, it's interesting that you point out the importance of the peer review element of it, because on the political level, there has been a lot of debate about the divide within the European Union member states. And this has been perhaps an aspect that has added to that feeling of a divide in terms of sort of East and West. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's clear. We need to erect mechanisms that will review the situation everywhere. There are problems everywhere. To take pressure on the media. That's commonplace in many countries that aren't fetching headlines right now. Pressures on civil society, the same. So we have rule of law issues in every corner of the European Union, and we need to tackle those. We can also learn, if I can just step outside the internal for a moment, we can learn from the UN experience, because the Universal Periodic Review procedure of the UN Human Rights Council surprised, I think, just about everybody in that it delivered more than was ever expected, and showed that a peer review of states assessing their fellow states, but in a mutually fair manner where everybody gets the same treatment, it can lead towards change, at least from a political point of view.
Yeah, just add to that, because I very much agree with that. I mean, sometimes with countries where, you know, there isn't much on the agenda in terms of what we can actually talk about or what we can agree to talk about. The one area, no matter what country we are talking to, that we can agree to talk about is the UPR process. And even countries where, you know, they haven't accepted, you know, let me give one example. I went to Eritrea recently. I was the first, I think, official of any international organization with human rights in the title that visited Eritrea. Had a discussion with senior political figures in Eritrea about human rights. And probably I can say that the one connect that we could make, because these were not easy discussions, but the one connect that we could make was around the UPR and about the implementation and about how to maybe provide and cooperate and work on the implementation, not of all the recommendations, because clearly they didn't accept all of the recommendations, but those recommendations that were accepted. And I think that the UPR process, I think, is one I think that we can build on, and as Michael says, probably learn from as well.
Other questions? Oh, two hands, young lady over there.
My name is Susanne Fratzek. I work for the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights, mostly in the field of EU enlargement policy and European neighborhood policy. And the internal, external discrepancies or inconsistencies have been touched upon already, so I don't want to go into that anymore. But just to mention that we come across these, or these are also brought forward to us in our projects in these two policy fields quite often. Another strand of inconsistency, however, I want to raise a question on is more in the external dimension, because with regard to North Macedonia, in the field of enlargement policy has for long been considered a field where the EU has succeeded in taking the role of a human rights promoter. Of course, it can be discussed with which sustainability if we look towards Hungary or Poland, etc., but still. But it depends to a large extent on its credibility and the consistency with which the instruments are applied. So with regard to North Macedonia, there has been, of course, the decision of the Council, or the blockage, or rather, it's to say, to open negotiations, although North Macedonia has fulfilled all its, let's say, homework, and especially in the field of rule of law and human rights, which the Commission has put center stage. And this, of course, takes away from the efficiency of the tools we can apply and the leverage we can achieve. But how do we deal with this situation when there's inconsistency due to political member state based deliberations? Or do you come across that too, because we are, in our projects, we're faced with that, and how can we learn from you how to deal with this? Thank you.
Well, I haven't been involved in on the enlargement side of things. That may be because I'm only in office 7 months, I think, so I haven't been asked to take an interest in it, so I can't comment on it specifically. The only thing I would say about the blocking the path to accession is that it has happened before. And it has happened in the case of many countries which are now happy members of the European Union. Indeed, even one that has become particularly unhappy, as you know, was blocked when it attempted to join in the 1960s. So the blocking has happened before, and I think that we have to look at the positive. Look at it a bit more positively. Blockages have been overcome before.
Could I just add, as a matter of, I think might be of interest for you, it's nothing to do with accession, but North Macedonia participates fully in the work of the Fundamental Rights Agency as an observer state. And a number of the Western Balkan countries are in a similar situation. So that even though we are confined very much to the internal matters of the Union, we do have this capacity to engage with a small number of external states. And I'm very happy that North Macedonia is fully involved now in all of our work.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I think we're actually running out of time because there is a secret time limit on this. So just a final question to each of you. You've already spoken, both of you, sort of about positive aspects of your work, but I was once told by a human rights activist that human rights communication needs to be about hope and opportunity, not fear and threat. So, question to each of you, what is it that gives you hope about your work in human rights?
Well, even if you look at, let's look at Africa. Let's look at all of the good news stories that we have seen coming out of Africa in recent times. Sudan, Ethiopia, the Gambia. I've been in 2 of those countries. I've been in Ethiopia and I was in, now there are still good news in Angola. One of the initiatives that we have started is what we call the Good Human Rights Story Initiative, where we platform stories, good human rights developments, positive developments in human rights, including in countries which are not always associated with a good human rights track record. So I think that we have to, it is very easy to slip into a very negative kind of, and a lot of bad things are happening. There's no doubt about that. And this isn't space, where you meet good stuff all the time. But we do have to recognise where positive things are taking place. I mean, the one, for example, that I would really like to drive for is on the death penalty. 3/4 of the countries in the world have either abolished it or have a moratorium. And this is an objective. I mean, complete abolition of the death penalty is a human rights objective and a target that is within sight. And if there is one area that I would certainly love to see the human rights community mobilising and making that drive, it's on the death penalty. And we talked about it. We talked about it yesterday with our friends from the United States.
Thank you.
Within the EU context, I'm quite optimistic at the present time. I feel that maybe we've hit the low level, down where, with a clarity we wouldn't otherwise have, we see what we need to do. And there are so many elements of it emerging. In the first place, we've recognized that we've been poor at conveying our messages, poor at convincing the people who need to be convinced of what we're saying. And we've invested heavily, including in the agency, on how we do a better, more scientific, smart job of communicating. Second, we've recognized that we have to get back to basics and locate our claims in law. We have to remind everybody and demonstrate ourselves that what we're making claims for are already committed to in treaties, instruments and bodies of law. Something that I think maybe to some extent had been overlooked in the engagement and in the discourse. Third, we have to work with social movements, including ones that are not historically associated with human rights. The arts is an example. It just comes to mind, but there are many others. The trade union movement, faith communities. There is the possibility to find or rediscover, indeed, platforms to work with them towards shared goals. We have to learn from what turned the tide on climate change in the past literally 1 year. The capacity, above all, of young people to marshal their voice of outrage towards social change. That for me is not something that's happening in another sector and doesn't affect us. It shows what can happen if we're smart and we work with young people so that their voice is heard. The incremental strengthening of institutions. I gave you some examples. We don't have time for many more, but they show me a system that has this ability to keep getting stronger, even though sometimes we don't notice those developments. And in the end, today is Human Rights Day. It's not a day to celebrate. It's not a basis for celebration, but it is a basis for acknowledgement. What we've constructed and are continuing to build since the horrors of the Second World War is astonishing. Pope John Paul II called human rights modernity's greatest achievement. I think he was right, and we should be proud of that achievement. Never be complacent or lazy. Keep investing in it, but acknowledging nevertheless that it's stronger than it's given credit for.
Thank you very much. So, I think we've come to the end of our discussion this evening. I'd like to say a very big thank you to Michael and Eamon for sharing your time, your thoughts, your wisdom, and a positive note at the end. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you to the audience for being here and for the questions, and thank you to the organisers for arranging it. Thank you very much indeed.